Thank you to our sponsors. Platinum sponsor, Gravity Forms. Build accessible, powerful WordPress forms with Gravity Forms. Flexible tools for creators, developers, and teams of all sizes. Platinum sponsor, WP Engine. WP Engine provides the most relied upon and trusted WordPress products for businesses, brands, and agencies of all sizes. Platinum sponsor, Woo. WooCommerce is the open-source e-commerce platform built on WordPress, helping merchants worldwide sell, manage, and grow their businesses. Gold sponsors, Ally Web Accessibility. Equalize Digital, websites for everyone. GoDaddy, Green Geeks Web Hosting, Yoast. Silver sponsors, Aardvark, Code Geek, Your Vision, Our Talent, One Team, Kinetic Iris, Kinsta, Pressable, Second Melody. Bronze sponsors, Nine Planets Hosting, Engage, Draw Attention, Multidots, NerdPress, OSAM Studio, AusEY, Australian Web Accessibility Initiative, Progress Planner, Quality Logic, Sharp, Simply Schedule Appointments, SiteGround, Stellar WP, Termageddon, Web Yes.
Welcome to WordPress Accessibility Day 2025. My name is Jeremy Rivera, and I'm a developer advocate from DQ Systems. Thank you for joining us for The Art of Accessibility, Making Documents Delightfully Inclusive with Samantha Merritt. Samantha Merritt is a senior accessibility specialist at the UK Ministry of Justice with a strong background in digital accessibility across the public sector. Certified in core competencies and the Accessible Document Specialist by the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, and a career spanning roles in various UK government departments, Samantha has led initiatives to improve the accessibility of digital content, services, and communications. Her work includes remediating complex documents and delivering training on creative inclusion documents and presentations. She is also a passionate advocate for embedding accessibility from the outset, and she has contributed to community events such as the UK Cross-Government Accessibility Quarterly, and is a frequent speaker on topics ranging from hosting accessible events to inclusive content strategy. Please feel free to add your questions in the Zoom Q&A section, and we'll answer them at the end of the session. Use the chat to connect with other attendees.
Thank you so much for choosing to join my session. This session is called The Art of Accessibility, Making Documents Delightfully Inclusive. My aim today is that you will leave the session feeling like you know a little bit more about document accessibility and how you can make sure what you're creating is accessible for the majority of your users. So the agenda for the session today, I always like to start off with a little bit about me. I always think it's nice when you join a session like this that you get to know a little bit about the presenter rather than diving straight into the content first of all. We're then going to talk about choosing the right document format, what that looks like, and why you might choose one format choice over another. I'll then take you through some top tips for creating wonderful Word documents that are accessible. We'll then move to look at polished presentations and consider how we can try to create accessible presentations. And then we'll finish with a look at Excel spreadsheets and spreadsheets in general, thinking about how we can make those excellent and accessible for our user base. I'll also include a disclaimer now that I do love dogs and I love an animal. So throughout the presentation, there are somewhat topical pictures of dogs, which I will audio describe so all of us can enjoy them together. But I wanted to forewarn you of that as we move through this presentation. So as I said, I always think it's nice that you guys get to know me a little bit before I spend the next 40 minutes or so with you. So who am I? Well, my name is Samantha Merritt. I'm a senior accessibility specialist and I work in the Ministry of Justice in the UK. I work as part of the digital accessibility team. One of my main roles and responsibilities within that team is to build accessibility skills across the organisation. So I do a lot of online and hands-on training to try and build up that capability. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a young woman in her 20s. I have blonde hair, which is in a ponytail today, and I'm wearing a pair of glasses. I always like to share a little bit more about myself to go just beyond the professional, just so you can really get to know me and who I am as a person. So I've got 4 different pictures on the slide that describe and attempt to sum me up, really. So starting from the far left, we have my dog, Bella. So my dog Bella is, she's the light of my life, and she really does make me smile every day. She's a grey Staffordshire Bull Terrier. The picture is her lying on our sofa, fast asleep, and really kind of sums up what she does on pretty much a daily basis. Moving across to the slide, on the bottom of my slide, I've got pictures of different travel items. I've got a passport, a sun hat, a camera. This is representing my love for travel. I love to go all over the world and experience different people, different cultures, and really immerse myself in other people's worlds. It's a big part of what I like to do away from work. In the top of my slide, I've got a picture of myself and my fiance Liam. One of our happy places is Disneyland. We like to go there quite a bit. It's a really nice place for us to connect. So again, that picture is us standing in front of the Disneyland castle. And finally, I have a picture of a lady doing some yoga on a sunset or a sunrise. Again, yoga is a big part of my life. It really helps me disconnect from everything else and just focus on the mind and body for a very short period of time. So that's a little bit about me, and hopefully it gives you a flavour of who I am and where I'm coming to you from today. But let's not waste any more time because we don't have much time together. So let's focus on document accessibility. And as I said in my agenda, we're going to start with choosing the right document format, and we're going to think about how that's really, really important. A lot of people question when I do training on document accessibility, why I put in about format choice at the start. For me, format actually has a really big impact on the final accessible output, because you could create a fully accessible document and then you could export it or convert it to something that's inaccessible. And so it's really, really important that we think about that and that we're choosing the right format from the outset. But what's the point in talking about creating these accessible documents if we don't actually define what they are? So on this slide, we've got our first dog picture, other than my beautiful Bella. The picture is of a pug sitting down with its head tilted to one side in front of a blackboard with lots of question marks all over it. I put that one in there because it looks like the pug's asking me for an answer to this question. If I was asked to define what is an accessible document, I would say an accessible document allows as many people as possible to access that information. So if you've ever tried to make a document accessible, it might feel a little bit tedious, it might feel a little bit overwhelming, there might be quite a lot to consider. But I always tell those that I work with and I train that creating accessible documents is so important, and it's really crucial that we think about it at every step. At the end of the day, why are we creating something if we don't want it to be read and understood by everybody? I think you've probably joined the session today because you think document accessibility is important, and I welcome you into that session with that mindset. But just in case you are wondering, why is it so important? Well, it ensures that everyone has the same opportunity to access the same information. That one sits top of my list. It's the reason why I do what I do and the reason why I like to talk about it as much as possible. It is rumoured as well to be part of the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, in the 3.0 version that's currently in progress. If that does eventually become a major part of the guidelines, then by learning about it now and making sure we're building in that progress now, hopefully we'll be in better state if and when that does appear in the guidelines. It's also the law. So I work in a public sector organisation. So for us, it's really important that we are producing accessible documents in the UK. So for us, we also have that to consider. However, that always sits at the bottom of my list because that's not how I want to motivate people to do accessibility. I want them to do it because they care and because they know it's a good thing to do and it benefits a lot more people than just a small user group. So for me, that's why we do document accessibility. So choosing the right format then. How do I do that? Because as I've said, it is really important that we think about it. There's lots of different choices when it comes to documents. You could create a spreadsheet, you could do a traditional document, it could be a presentation, it could be a PDF. When people ask me, I don't know, I never know which one to choose. There's a lot out there. We always get asked for the same version, but is there a better way of doing it? I always take it back to basics. Just ask yourself 3 different questions. Who's going to use the document? How are they going to use it? And how are you going to share it with them? The answer to those 3 questions often helps you determine what document format type is best. For example, if people are going to use the document to calculate budgets or work out their financial spend for the month, a spreadsheet probably works well for that, especially if you're going to share it over an email and you're not necessarily going to publish it anywhere. It's more just for your document team files. But again, if you're going to present information to people in a meeting, it's a board meeting, maybe a presentation works, you want something on the screen that's visual. The answer to those questions will always vary, but it's really important that you consider those answers carefully because that could help you think about what format type is best. So let's kick off with the first one, which is PowerPoint or presentation format, whatever it is that you tend to use in your organization. I've got a picture of a dog on this slide with one eye very close to the camera and the words, "I have my eye on you," written at the top. The reason the dog is looking quite intense is because I would say PowerPoint is one of the most misused format types. PowerPoint should primarily be used for visual presentations that tell a story. So they should be used for presentations only, and they are very much a visual tool, but the presenter is the main focus. They're there as a backup, as a resource after the session maybe, to give extra information. What they shouldn't be used for is projects or reports. And we do see this a lot within sort of our space and the space that I work in. Often they are produced in PowerPoint, but they're actually long reports that really would be better off in Word. So unless you're going to present that information, then maybe a presentation format is not the best choice. On the other hand, if you're thinking about spreadsheets, and again, I'm using Excel as an example here, Excel should be used to store, analyze, report on kind of large amounts of data. So you might want to use it for like budget sheets or balance books or attendance reports, but we don't tend to try and use Excel for kind of writing lots of text. So project management, spreadsheets are not ideal, and forms don't really work very well in Excel either. Then we come to documents, the big one, the one that kind of covers a lot of stuff. In this case, again, I'm using Word as an example, but you could think of any kind of software that you use. It would be the same type premise. What we tend to say in our organisation is if it's made in Word, it can stay in Word. There are very few instances where converting that Word document into another file format is beneficial, so it's always better to keep it in Word if you've created it there. If you're in doubt about what document format to use, then maybe opt for Word because 9 times out of 10, it's going to be the most suitable format. Why is it good? Why is a document the best thing? Well, documents tend to be more flexible. They work well if you do need to convert them to something like a PDF, for example. And they tend to be more compatible and useful with assistive technology. It's not to say you can't use any kind of assistive tech with the other file formats, because you absolutely can. But Word documents tend to be more intuitive and much easier to navigate because they are more simple in their design. Are there other options? Of course there are. Depending on the context, what you're doing and what you're working on, you might be sending an email. Just think, do I need to attach a document to this, or could I just put it in the email instead? Of course, I totally acknowledge there are times when attaching a document is sensible, makes sense and it works, but just consider whether it really is needed with what you're doing. And instead of publishing documents on websites, could you just paste them onto a web page? Consider whether you really do need documents in that scenario or whether you could create more what we call HTML content instead. Then we come to PDFs. Now, this very much is a UK government stance on the subject, and it might differ depending on where you work and what you do. If I get asked the question, should I create a PDF with that? My answer pretty much most of the time is no. I've got another dog meme on this slide. I've got a puppy with his paw held up to the camera, and the words read, "How about no," written across the top. That sums up pretty well how we advise teams to approach PDF accessibility and PDFs in general. We had a testimonial from one of assistive technology users that we work with, and they said, "I always open a PDF with trepidation, because more than half the time trying to read one with my assistive technology is a frustrating experience. I think that's quite common feeling among those who do use assistive technology, that PDFs often aren't checked for accessibility or aren't made accessible, which can create real problems for them when they're trying to access that information. Why are they so problematic? Well, again, I've got another dog on this slide. He doesn't look very happy. It's a bulldog. His chin's on the floor and the words read, "Oh, look, another PDF file." Kind of sums up how I feel. There was a time when within UK government, there was quite a churn of PDF files. It was kind of the way we did things. They're not ideal because they're not really designed to be that flexible. That wasn't their intention when they were created. And often to read them, they can be quite long. There will be quite a lot of information in them, and they're just not very adaptable and flexible to meet user needs. Of course, on the contrast, if you're going to create something like a Word document, it includes all of that and more, which again is one of the reasons why we tend to advise people just to keep it simple and keep to what you know. So now we kind of know what format types there are and choices are out there. Let's consider wonderful Word documents or documents in general and talk about some of the main things to think about. Just to flag before I start, a lot of the advice you will have already noticed I'm giving today is based on the Microsoft suite, but the tips I'm providing you can be applied regardless of the type of software you might be using. So don't be put off if you think it's all about Microsoft. A lot of the things refer back to their tools because that's what we use in our organization, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can't apply the same methodology elsewhere. So I'm going in thick and fast, and I'm starting off with document headings. There is no way I could talk about accessible documents without addressing headings. Headings are the backbone of any document. A user should be able to scan a document using just the headings and get a really good overview of what you're talking about. Headings give that information structure, they split it into different sections, and they really do help sighted and AT assistive technology users access that content. You've got to make sure your headings are descriptive and make sure they are understandable on their own. Let your heading text tell the story about the contents of that next paragraph or the page. So as I've said, screen reader users might use headings to navigate the document. In fact, it's probably more than likely that they will. Because this means they can select any part of the document that they want to read more about and go straight there. It's not just screen reader users that will use it. Voice recognition software users might also use voice commands. But at the end of the day, all readers will benefit from a really well-structured document that can be navigated quite easily. Things to think about when you're adding headings. Making it bold and making it size 28 does not make it a heading. You must use the styles that any software, but if in this case we're talking about Word, provide to make sure they are accessible. It's just a word of warning as well that the styled headings in Word are not necessarily accessible from the outset. They might often use like a really thin font or a light blue font. So just make sure you modify them to suit your own needs and make sure they're accessible with your branding as well. The other thing to flag is the title style. So we tend not to use the title style in Word. We tend to use heading 1 as our first heading. The title style doesn't really do much for us. If we want headings in a sequential order, we should always start with 1, and then we have only one of those per document most of the time and work from there. Moving on from headings, because I hope now I've convinced you that they are really, really important. We're going to talk about accessible tables, and again, this is really, really important. I love a table when used correctly. Tables are really great. They're a useful tool for organizing data, making comparisons between data sets, and being able to kind of see things at a glance and compare them. However, to make a table accessible, you do need to ensure that you think about quite a few different things. But once you've used and embedded these, you are on your way to creating a nice accessible table. One thing I would say before I start is please do not add tables as images into your document. So please don't screenshot a table and paste it into a document as an image. It renders that information completely inaccessible. And even if you were able to create some kind of alternative text to describe what that image shows, I doubt it would cover the full breadth and depth of that information in detail. So with that aside, if you're creating a table in your document, make sure it has a header row. Don't let your rows break across pages. So don't let rows start on one page and then finish on the next. Make sure rows stay together on each page. I've said identify a header row, and most of the time that works, but you might want a header column, or you might want a row and a column. There's no necessarily right or wrong with that, as long as it makes sense in the context in which you're working on. Please don't split or merge cells in your table. Keep things nice and regular. Keep the structure in a way that makes logical sense. Make sure you add a title for your table so people know what the table's about and what the information relates to. And also consider whether you need to add alternative text to your table. So text to describe what the table shows. This isn't always necessary, but it's a really nice add-on if your table is a little bit complex or you think a user might just benefit from a little bit of extra information about that table. If you're not familiar with adding alternative text to table, it is under the Properties tab in most software. And also just think of it like writing alternative text for an image. It follows a very similar pattern, but you're just writing it for a table instead. Or one final check you can do on tables is check that you can tab through them in a logical order. So just make sure you start from the top row and work your way down and make sure it makes sense to you and then to your user. So I have already mentioned the table's properties box, but if you were to right click or choose that option for your table, you can add your title, your alt text, and set your header row in that box as well. And as we've said, never paste an image of a table in. It will prevent screen readers from accessing that information, and it's really not best practice. Enough of the negative though, let's go back to another topic, which in this case is, are headers and footers accessible? Now, I have another dog meme for you. Come on, it's been a while since I've shown you one. This time we've got a golden lab who looks like they're smiling at the camera with their tongue hanging out, and the speech bubble reads no. And the question he's answering is, are headers and footers accessible? Page headers and footers are not automatically read by screen readers under recent testing. If you want the information in that header or footer to be conveyed to the reader or the user, then you need to include it in the main body copy of your content. Page numbers are fine to use because that information is often shown elsewhere. But we often see people put version numbers or dates in the header and footer, and that does mean that other users might not be able to access or read that content. Adding spacing in any document is interesting and can be done in various ways. But there are a few simple things to remember to make sure it remains accessible. Don't use the Enter key on your keyboard to add space or start content on a new page. Use page breaks instead. Use tabs instead of spaces if you really do need to separate text, and use the line spacing options to create space between subjects or objects on the page. If you're using Word, you can turn on your show hide markers. The show hide markers, the icon appears as kind of a backwards P if you're looking at it visually. They show where the extra spaces are in your document, which make it really easy to find and delete the ones you don't want. Also be mindful of the size of your margins. Again, changing margin sizes can cause problems. So if you don't have to touch them, then I'd kind of steer people away from playing with your margins. One of the reasons why we use the Enter key to create space on a page is for screen reader experience. Often screen reader users might get to spaces on the page and just hear enter, enter. Sorry, they'll hear blank, blank, blank until they get to the next bit of content, which isn't the best user experience. Images and alt text. I definitely couldn't talk about accessible documents without talking about alternative text. It's so important. Any images that you use in a document need alternative text. It's also commonly referred to as alt text, and that is how I'm going to refer to it from now on. There are various ways you can add alternative text to images, and most software programs make it pretty easy. Most of the time, if you right-click or you choose the properties of your image using the properties menu, you'll be able to add alternative text to your image. What I would say is I often get people who will allow the automation of your software to add alternative to text itself. I would always double check this. Software, in my experience at the moment, is not necessarily great at getting it right. Alt text is very context dependent, and what you want to say is very, very personal to what you're editing rather than necessarily something generic. So just tell the user what they need to know and don't overload them with other content. I have an example of alt text here, and I've given some different variations. Images can make you feel a particular way, and that's something that should be available to everybody, even people that use screen readers. People often forget that with pictures because they think, oh, well, you know, they're very visual, so I can't describe them. You absolutely can, and you should. The picture on this slide is a large Great Dane with a wild look, catching a treat midair with his mouth wide open. An example of bad alt text for this image would be something like image342.jpg. It's just the file name, doesn't say anything, it's really unhelpful. Something that's okay could be dog with its mouth wide open. It's quite literal, that is exactly what the picture is of, but actually to me there's more to this picture than meets the eye. In my description, I said the dog had a wild look in its eye. I talked about the fact that its mouth was wide open with it catching a treat midair. The lips are flopping open. That tells me a lot more about that image. It's comical. I'm getting a nice feeling from that. I'm getting a good emotion from that. I feel like I want to smile at that description. It sounds quite funny. And that's what I want to get across to any user, no matter what tech they're using or how they're accessing that information. So just always think about how you're writing alt text and what it says, because you might be using that image for a particular reason and your alternative text should say that. And finally, thinking about formatting link text. I've got a very grumpy looking dog on this slide, got wild hair, and this is how I feel when I review documents that have inaccessible link text. We often see click here, read more information, used in isolation with no surrounding context. Screen reader users often will bring up a list of links to navigate through the content, and having link text like that is really unhelpful and doesn't tell the user where they're going to be taken. Make sure you don't use full URLs and just make your link text descriptive. And finally, on Word documents, just don't forget that designing for neurodiversity is often overlooked. I've got a dog image on this slide of a black Labrador with big brown eyes looking lovingly at the camera. And the words read, "Don't forget me." That's trying to signify that although we haven't covered everything in this section, things like using plain English, don't use bold, italics, or underline in big amounts, and making sure you're checking your color contrast is all still really important, even if we haven't mentioned it specifically today. Moving on, as time is ticking, we're going to talk about polished presentations and what we can do in a presentation format to make sure they're accessible. Use the master slide. So slide master or the master slide create accessible layouts and ensure consistency across your presentation. If you're using Microsoft PowerPoint, you can view the slide master under the View tab, but all software will have a version of a master layout. Make sure your master layout is accessible, so make sure that colors work, and if you're using any kind of logos or anything, they are also accessible, but it's really, really important to make sure that you do use that within your slides. Sections are also a nice way in a presentation to give it structure. So if you've got a particularly long presentation, adding sections can be a nice way to split the information into several different topic areas. And again, the user can then navigate to the bits that they maybe want to read more about or go back to and revisit sections they were unsure about. It very much is similar to how a table of contents might help to break up content. So again, it's really important to think about that when you're creating those sections in your presentation. Unique slide titles are a very, very important thing for accessible presentations. You must have unique descriptive titles on each slide, even if they're not visible, but that is not advisable best practice. Visible headings are always the best way to go. Screen reader users might rely on the slide titles to know which slide they're on and to know whether they've moved on or moved backwards a slide, depending on their command. If you're skimming or using a screen reader, they can quickly scan through those titles as well and go to the slide that they want. If you've got multiple slides with the same information, consider adding like a one, a continued, or some kind of note in the slide title to make it clear that it is a different slide but contains very similar information. And some formatting tips for you. Now, these are very similar to the Word ones, so there isn't much difference here, but there is a few more things to think about when it comes to formatting presentations. And again, I've got a very grumpy, angry looking dog because again, these are some of the things that I think people forget about when it comes to presentations, but they are still really important. Using a readable font is very important. Be generous with your spacing still. Don't make slides that are packed with information. Make sure there's enough space between content. Don't use transitions, keep links short and descriptive, be mindful of your jargon, and as we've said, make sure your slide titles are unique. They're quite specific to PowerPoint in some ways because if you're presenting this information, the text has got to be big and you've got to make sure that you're presenting information in a way that's quick, easy, and easy to digest. But sometimes they're overlooked when creating PowerPoints because there's so many other things to think about. And one final tip I would give if you are creating presentations, just think about your use of colour. So don't use colour on its own to specify anything. So if you're giving a presentation, be mindful that people are going to be experiencing those slides in different ways. On the slide, I have two circles. One is red and the other is red with the letter A. So to avoid indicating with colour alone, I might say if you say something like highlighted in red is, not everyone's going to know what that is or where it is on the slide. Instead, I would say labelled with letter A and coloured red. There may be some people in your audience who are not viewing the screen at all, so send the slides in advance. So having those short descriptions is also really, really helpful in the notes section. And we move into our final section of the session, which is on Excel spreadsheets or spreadsheets in general, and thinking about how we can create excellent versions of those. So the first thing to think about with spreadsheets is index sheets, and they are really important. So index sheets, if you have several sheets in your workbook, it's really helpful to provide an index sheet at the beginning. That should tell the user what the workbook is about and provide a contents list, which is hyperlinked to each sheet. It might be quite obvious why that's important, and hopefully it is. It's so that users can access the information clearly and they know what that spreadsheet's about and they can really kind of delve into the details straight away. Cell A1 is such an important cell, but often is not thought about too much. It should never be left blank. There are different ways you can use it though, and this is where it gets interesting. And that's why on this slide, I have a beagle with a magnifying glass looking as if he's kind of thinking, well, how can I use it? And he's trying to answer that question. So on the first sheet, cell A1 can be used to give a workbook summary. So as described in the previous section, that's kind of how that cell can be used. But on any worksheet, cell A1 can also be used for the title of the table that follows. So it very much depends on how big your spreadsheet is and how you've set it up as to how you might use cell A1. Name your sheets, name your tables. So it's important that you name your file and name your worksheets in Excel. So by default, worksheets are normally named like sheet 1, sheet 2, but you should rename these and give them some more of a meaningful name. Why is that? Well, that just helps the user know what the information is inside them. As with any application, it's important that tables are properly created with correctly marked up header rows and columns, very much like we said about using them in a normal document. However, you can convert data into an accessible table, which makes it easier to navigate. If you want to give your table a descriptive name, normally under the table tab, there'll be a section that says table name. Just make sure you add something in there. The more descriptive, the better, as with all of these things. No blanking, no merging. So do not merge or split cells, very similar to what we discussed in a Word document, for example. It creates an irregular pattern and can make the data quite hard to understand. Screen reader users might often count table cells to keep track of their locations. So when you nest tables, you merge or split cells, It can be hard to keep count, and that doesn't really provide much helpful information. It's recommended that any blank cells are replaced with something. We don't like to leave cells blank, so either an NA for like not applicable, or a dash or a hyphen. Again, that one's not necessarily the best because it can have multiple meanings, but maybe even putting 0 in there if it's just if it's a budget sheet, just so that you've covered something in there that doesn't affect the rest of the content. When you have data in kind of a tabular format, if there are any empty rows or columns, then the user may assume they've reached the end of that data. So try and delete anything that is empty, doesn't serve a purpose, and is just there because you thought you might add more information but never did. It just makes things more confusing if we don't kind of clean up our spreadsheet, I suppose, once we've finished editing it. So just make sure you think about that when you're kind of finalizing your spreadsheet. That was just a whistle-stop tour of accessible spreadsheets, and I've ended with a dog with its nose really, really close to the camera, kind of almost blurry because he's so close. I just think sometimes you've got to look a little bit deeper when you're looking at Excel spreadsheets. There's a lot to think about when it comes to accessibility, and it can be hard to kind of see where you've left a blank cell or you've got an empty row there that you didn't realise. So just have a double check and make sure it is as clean as possible. So in our final 5 minutes, I'm going to leave you with some final thoughts of my own. Hopefully you got some good tips today, things maybe you didn't know, or just a helpful refresher or reminder if you're more proficient in this space. Some best practice to remember, and to finish us off and to finalize this, I've got a white dog winking at the camera with its mouth open. Kind of just remember this best practice if you can. If your document is not for personal use, so just for yourself, it should be tested and verified to make sure it is accessible. You don't necessarily know where that document's going to end up. And actually, even if you're sharing it with 2 or 3 colleagues, you might not necessarily know any access needs or accessibility requirements they have. So producing accessible content just sets a really nice precedent and gives you an opportunity to make sure that you're providing inclusive content for everybody. Remember that producing 2 versions of a document is not ideal. So we often hear from people, oh, it's okay, I'll create my version and then I'll create an accessible version. Having one accessible version is the best. We don't like to create one for one person, one for the other. It's nice to be able to produce one document that meets all requirements, or as many as possible. Remember to test at every stage of development. So just like you would if you were creating a digital product on the web, for example, make sure you're checking document accessibility at every turn. That will help to make sure that when you get to the end of editing or end of creating your document, you've pretty much encountered everything and built everything in, and you don't have to think about running checks at that point and making substantial changes, which might disrupt what you'd planned. And make sure, as with all accessibility things, I think I've said this multiple times over the years, build in accessibility from the beginning. If you're using an accessible template, if you're using the right tools and the right software, you can create an accessible document in a relatively easy way, and it doesn't have to be this big chore that I think is often associated with creating accessible documents. So consider it from the beginning, and if you're not the document owner or the editor, try and plant that seed in others' minds when you're hearing about them creating content, so that you can make sure that content is created in an accessible way from the start. I just want to end. I know we're going to go down to questions now, but thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you listening to me from wherever you are and whatever time of day it is, and I hope you found it useful. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Samantha. So we're going to jump into Q&A. I think if you read the chat, a lot of them appreciated your dogs as well as you and all the information that you've given. So we're going to answer Gerson's first, and his question is Adobe Acrobat really the only proper tool to make PDFs tagged and accessible?
So really good, great question. So no, Adobe Acrobat is definitely not the only proper tool you can use. It's probably the most widely known and probably most widely used, or at least it is in my sphere, which is why I sort of talked about it in the presentation. But there are lots of alternatives. There's lots of companies out there that can offer paid for versions as well. my piece of advice to you would just be careful. Some of them are advertised as remediation tools, fully automated. Of course, we know with all sorts of accessibility, one size doesn't fit all, so it's not going to deliver you an accessible solution. So maybe you'll always need to kind of do a bit of manual work. There are also tools like Pack, that's a free tool that I use quite a bit. It kind of goes one step further than Acrobat and kind of does full PDF UA compliance, which I find really helpful when you're trying to fix PDFs. So again, just have a look and make sure you choose the right tool that works for you, but you don't have to use Acrobat if you don't want to.
It's good to know. I just learned that too. I thought Acrobat was the only one, so thank you. Thank you for sharing that. The next question we have is from I'm not going to try to pronounce this. I use Pack 2024 for checking PDFs and the Acrobat built-in functions. Can you recommend other tools that we could use?
So kind of similar question, I guess, to the last one in a way. There's another free tool called Pave, which you can use. That's mostly up for files that are less than 5 megabytes. So it depends on the size of your file on that one. But there are also lots of paid for tools. I don't use any of them myself, so I can't recommend one or the other. But there are lots of names like Common Look PDF, Access 4, Equidocs. These are all examples of other tools in the market. But as I say, I don't know much about any of them. I just know they exist.
All right, thank you so much. And then we have a couple from Claire Brotherton. If an image in a document is decorative, what should you do?
Yeah, really good question. It can be tackled in a couple of ways. There is a mark decorative box. However, I always try and steer people away from using that because I think an image will always normally have a purpose. You will have put it in there for some reason. For example, if you talk about healthy eating and you've got a picture of an apple, you've put it in there because you think that's an example of something healthy to eat. So I would probably describe that so people get an understanding about what you mean when you say healthy eating in your context. There's very few instances where images are purely decorative. If I'm using a logo, it's because I want to make sure that people know that document is owned by that organization, for example. So always consider how decorative it really is. If you really don't think it adds any extra value, one, maybe consider removing it. If you really do think it should be there, then maybe add some, you can tick the mark as decorative box, but we really, really use that in cases where, yeah, there's really no added value to adding a description at all, which in most cases is quite rare, I believe. But that box is always there if you need to use it.
All right, thank you. And then the next question is, you said don't use underline in documents, but is this not best practice for links?
Absolutely. And apologies if that came over in the wrong way. That's not what I intended at all from that comment. Links should always be underlined. The reason why we don't underline anything else is for the reason that people can then hopefully identify links with ease. So if we just keep limited to underlining links, then people can scan documents and find that information visually quite easily. If we start underlining other things, you might try and click on it because you assume it's probably a link and it's not, and it can just get a little bit confusing. So yes, absolutely, keep your underline for links, but links only.
Thank you for the clarification. So from Kwaku, we have, what's the single most common accessibility mistake you see in digital documents, and how could someone quickly fix it? And what's one tip for beginners often overlook that can make document instantly more accessible?
Yeah, I love this question. There's quite a lot in there, but actually there's probably one answer that can answer all of it. So I think for me, the most common mistake is headings or lack of heading structure. People often, through no fault of their own, because they don't realize it's there, not make something a heading through formatting and just make it size 25 bold and say, look, visually that looks like a heading. And yes, you're not wrong, it does. But actually, from a formatting and accessibility perspective, that doesn't help the structure of the document, makes it really hard to navigate and gives it no kind of structure or easy to navigable table of contents either, which is really important for documents. And the same goes for a presentation as well. Every slide should need a unique title. That's effectively a heading in a document. There's no difference really. It's just the way the documents are set out. So for me, the most common mistake is no headings, which then means that you don't have a good table of contents. You can't navigate easily. The knock-on effects of that are quite wide. If you just add headings, you've instantly made your document much easier to kind of make your way through. So if you're a beginner in this space and you're a little bit overwhelmed, there was quite a lot in that presentation because I wanted to try and get across quite a bit in a short amount of time. But I think alternative text and adding in headings are really crucial. And if you do that throughout your document, as a beginner, you can make a big impact on the final accessible output in a way that, other tips might not have as an overarching effect.
All right, thank you so much. We have one from Taco. So, how accessible are the generated PDF versions of PowerPoint slide decks? Is Google Sheets better or worse?
So they're not very accessible is the short answer to that, which kind of helps it keep it simple. But yeah, PowerPoint slides that are converted to PDF, the two document types were never meant to be compatible. PowerPoints are used for presentations. It's very unlikely that they are ever produced to be in PDF format because PDFs have a very different use case. It's not impossible to make them accessible, but it's not very easy at all, especially if you've got extra bits in there like images and lots of other things in a PowerPoint deck, which you probably would have because that's how PowerPoints are normally designed. Making that accessible in PDF format can be quite tricky. Google Slides, Google, any kind of Google product, again, I don't think it's any particularly better. I think it's always going to be problematic converting a presentation into a PDF. The two are just not going to work very well.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Again, I'm learning something as I'm answering or asking these questions. So, from Isabel, do you think that the accessibility checker of PowerPoint is helpful for making an accessible presentation?
Absolutely. I always, and in any kind of product where you've got an accessibility checker, please use it. We always say that don't rely on it. So I always say to people, it's your starting point. Run the checker. When you finished, you've got your document ready, you think it's good to go. Run the checker on it, and then action anything that comes out of that. But then there's a few more manual checks that you also need to do. So it won't cover everything. So for example, it doesn't check all types of color contrast. So it will check if you've got bright red text on a white background or something that's kind of more obvious when it comes to color contrast. But if you're using two blues that are just slightly off contrast when it comes to the ratios, it wouldn't necessarily pick that up. So therefore, you checking that manually is going to give you the best result. Similarly, if you've got links in your presentation or your document and you've just put them in as URLs, it's not going to pick up that's an accessibility issue, but that really is an accessibility problem that we would need to check through manually. So the checkers are brilliant. If you're a beginner in this space, they often explain why it's a problem and how to fix it, which is brilliant. But don't rely on them alone because they don't cover everything and they will miss bits. So you will always be more powerful than the checker, which is what I like to tell people.
All right, thank you, thank you. And we have one final question from Sally. Does compressing a PDF affect its accessibility?
This is a great question. And unfortunately, I can't say a yes or no or give a really point blank answer because it depends on how the compression is done and what elements are removed when it is compressed. So often compressing a PDF will flatten it. So it will turn the text and structure into images, which can obviously remove tags, reading order, alt text, some of that interactive elements if you've got form fields and things like that in there. It can also remove embedded fonts, which can cause problems for accessibility. And some third-party tools that compress them can remove metadata to try and reduce file size, which removes titles and authors, etc. So my best advice, if you do need to compress a PDF file, is do it and then use a tool like your Adobe Acrobat, your Pack, whatever it is you use to check accessibility, to check what it looks like after you've compressed it. And then you might need to add some of those bits back in because those things are fundamental for an accessible PDF. So we can't ignore that they need to be in there. So don't let it affect the accessibility of your final file.
All right, thank you so much. I think we've answered all of the questions. Well, I think you've answered all of the questions rather. Thank you again. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think it was like hyper educational and we appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. No, it was really good. And thank you everyone for chiming in and engaging. It's been really great.
Okay, so for the chat, thank you for attending the session with Samantha Merritt. You could continue the conversation in the chat or on social media using the hashtag WPA11Y Day and hashtag WPAD 2025. We also appreciate it if you go to 2025.wpaccessibilityday/feedback to provide anonymous feedback for our speakers on their presentation. You could enter to win a t-shirt while you're there. So stay tuned for Invisible Until It Hurts, Rethinking Brand Design Through the Lens of Accessibility, coming up next with Victoria Ota at 10 a.m. UTC. And while you're waiting, don't forget to visit our sponsors page to grab virtual swag and enter for a chance to win great prizes. See you in the next session. And thank you again, Samantha.